So there was a study conducted in 1996, 1997, and in that study, they visited Dr. K.L. Chowdhury. He visited a lot of the death camps and he carried out a study, and it was also submitted to the National Human Rights Commission. So he pointed out a lot of very, very disturbing facts. It was about the replacement rate among the Kashmiri Pandits living in the refugee camps. So what is the replacement rate? So replacement rate is, in any society, there are some individuals who are going to be dying, and then there will be new individuals being born, right? And for the population to remain, by and large, static, you need a replacement rate of around 1.2 or 1.3. That means for every person who is dying, another 1.2 or 1.3 new individuals should be born. Okay, so whereas what was happening in the death camp, in the refugee camps, was the replacement ratio was 0.3. That was only 3 individuals were being born for every 12 individuals who were dying. Okay, and if that trend continued, then the Kashmiri Hindu population would have simply become extinct. Good morning, everyone. Good evening, everyone. The movie The Kashmir Files has been immensely popular, right? And then it has talked about the genocide of Kashmiri Hindus on January 19, 1990. So some of the questions that always arise are, was it a one-off incident? Was it even a genocide? Right? These are some of the questions that have been raised in the media. I will talk a little bit about the movie towards the end, but I want to start with the Sanskriti of Kashmir. So when we talk about Kashmir, the oldest references to Kashmir come from the writings of Panini. So the grammarian Panini in his Ashtadhyayi, he talks about Kashmirika. So those are the people of Kashmir. Okay, so in the region of Kashmir, he talks about them. And we also, even going before that, we have some of the recensions and the shakas of the Vedas that were composed in Kashmir and compiled in Kashmir. So Kashmir has a really old heritage, really old culture, very old Sanskriti, going all the way back to the Vedic times. And when we come back to around 300 BCE, so I talked a little bit about Panini. Panini lived and wrote probably around 700 or 600 BCE. We do not know his exact time, but he refers to Kashmir and the people of Kashmir as Kashmirika. Then when we fast forward a little bit, come back to the classical times when the Greco-Roman writers were writing, which is a period from around 400 BCE all the way up to 100, 150 CE. We have writers like Ptolemy, Herodotus, and others who are referring to Kashmir by various cognates, Greek cognates. They use words like Kaspairus and similar sounding words to refer to Kashmir. So Kashmir has a really old legacy, which has been very central to Hinduism, which has been very, very central to Hindu culture. So this is where I wanted to start with, because that's when we get a real perspective of how deep and how ancient the Kashmiri culture is. And sometimes people raise an argument, should not there be a plebiscite? Should not the people of Kashmir today decide what their culture should be, what their future should be, and everything? But culture is not decided by one generation of people. Culture is not decided by one election or one plebiscite or any of these things. Culture is something which we have inherited over thousands of years. And that means that has to be preserved. And we cannot take arbitrary decisions against that, because society is consumed by religious fundamentalism or extremism or radicalism at a particular point in time. This is the first point I wanted to make. And then second point I would like to make regarding the Sanskriti of Kashmir is, there was a very great Kashmiri Shaiva philosopher by the name Abhinav Gupta. He lived around the 8th or 9th century CE. And then he wrote this very famous philosophy by the name Pratyabhijna. So he was not a native of Kashmir itself. Okay. He actually comes from a place in and around the Ganga Jamuna Doab, which is current day Mathura, Agra, and all of these places in and around that place. So his ancestors, that is his father or his grandfather, they migrate from this region. They go to Kashmir. They settle down and they start uh, becoming very important scholars. They start writing a lot of texts, and then Abhinav Gupta comes from their lineage. But he refers to himself as a Kashmiri ka too. Repeatedly, he does that in his writings because Kashmir is not something which was seen as just a geographical center by our Hindus. It was also a very important center of Hindu learning. That's why someone like Abhinav Gupta, who originated in today's Uttar Pradesh, moves to Kashmir. His parents or his grandparents, they moved to Kashmir, but he still identifies himself as Kashmirika. Then we have this famous Advaita philosopher, Adi Shankaracharya. He came from what is today's Kerala in South India. Then he travels all over. He goes to Kashmir, and then it becomes a very important center of learning. He writes there. He compiles texts, everything, and you still have a very famous place called the Shankaracharya Hill in Srinagar even today. So the reason I mentioned all of these things is the Sanskriti of Kashmir is very important and probably a lot more important than the politics of a given point in time, because politics can always change, right? If you go back a few centuries or even a couple of 100 years, there was no Pakistan. Okay, but in 1947, you started having Pakistan because the politics and then the dynamics of societies changed. So we cannot decide the course of history by ignoring our heritage, by ignoring our culture, and by simply focusing on the politics of a given point in time. That's the reason I mentioned this. So the name Kashmir itself comes from Kashyapa Rishi, okay, who was a progenitor and who resided in Kashmir. And then Kashyapa Rishi is very important to Hindu Dharma, and that's where the name Kashmir itself comes from. And one important thought or one question that comes to everyone's mind is, why do we have so many Pandits in Kashmir? Why not all the other jatis? There are other jatis too who exist in Kashmir, but Pandits are larger in number. Okay, so but this is for a very important reason, and this is not just unique to Kashmir. Okay, Kashmir was a center of learning, right? And today, when we talk of learning, we go to universities, and most of the time, the universities or colleges are right in the place where we live. Okay, so if you are living in a small town like Vishakhapatnam, then you are going to have a bunch of colleges then and there. So you are just going to go there and you are going to study and come back. But in the ancient time, there were only a few universities, there are only a few centers of learning. Some of them well known to people are Nalanda, Takshashila in today's Pakistan, then Kanchipuram in South India, then you have Kashmir in North India. These are all very important centers of learning. That's why a lot of people, they moved to these places, they became resident scholars, and then they lived there for a few years and they studied philosophies, and then they compiled texts, and then they uh, preached, and then they founded institutions. That's the reason you have a large number of Pandits living in Kashmir. And this is not only unique to Kashmir, this is also true of places like Lahore. Okay? So there is a very famous historian by the name Andre Vink. He writes about, among other things, he writes about the invasion of Muslims into the Indian subcontinent, into the Sindh province, and into current day Lahore and all of these places. And then he talks about where Lahore itself got its name. It gets its name from Lava, son of Sri Rama. Okay, so Rama had twin sons, Lava and Kusha. That's why you have two places, Lahore and Kasur in Pakistan, which are nearby, and both of them were important centers of learning. And Andre Vink points out that when the Islamic invasions happened, Lahore was a very important center of learning and a place where there were a large number of Brahmins residing. Once again, the reason for that was it was a center of learning. So a lot of Pandits from other parts of India, they traveled to Lahore and they settled there. And then you ended up having a large proportion of Brahmins living there. The same thing happened in Kashmir. A lot of scholars traveled from other parts of India. I talked about the example of Abhinav Gupta, whose parents or grandparents, they moved to Kashmir, and then it becomes a center of learning. That's why you have a large concentration of Pandits who lived in Kashmir for thousands of years. So Kashmir was 100% Hindu society until the beginning of the 14th century. So that's where Mir Shah, he invades Kashmir and he starts imposing Islam on Kashmiris. So there are forced conversions. And then what we talk about, exodus of Kashmiri Pandits that happened in 1990, it was not the first time it happened. That was the seventh genocide or the seventh exodus of the Kashmiri Pandits that happened in 1990. Prior to that, over the preceding 600 years, there have been many other exoduses. There have been many other genocides of Kashmiri Pandits, and Professor K.L. Bond talks about that in his book, Paradise Lost, Seven Exoduses of Kashmiri Pandits. So he recounts every one of those, starting from 1320 onwards, all the way up to 1990. So Mir Shah started forcing the Pandits to convert to Islam. So those who did not convert were persecuted, and then jizya was imposed upon them, and then they were often slaughtered, and all of these things happened. But one of the most treacherous genocide happened around 1380 or 1390 CE, when Sikandar was the Sultan, and then he forced a large number of Kashmiri Pandits to convert. And when they refused, he slaughtered them. And there is a place called Bate Mazar in Srinagar by the lake. And that's where he slaughtered more than 100,000 Kashmiri Pandits, and then burnt them, and their ashes were dissolved in the lake. And then he cut their Janayu, or the sacred thread, and then he piled them up. And then Professor K.L. Bond writes that they formed 7 hillocks. That many number of sacred threads were cut, and then they were piled up by the banks of the lake. So this happened sometime around 1380 or 1390. And every time such a genocide happened, and every time persecution happened, Kashmiri Pandits will flee Kashmir. They will go somewhere to the plains, and then they will live there for some time, and they will, when situation became a little bit better, they'll come back. And the reason was simple. For most people, they cannot just like that leave their homes and go elsewhere and live. What are they going to do for their livelihood? So they will have to come back. That's why Kashmiri Pandits often came back. But every time they came back, they will face persecution in Kashmir, except Akbar, who was more tolerant compared to all the other Mughal emperors. He removed the jizya that was imposed on Kashmiris, but all the other kings who followed him, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, everyone, they reimposed the jizya. So when you look at the history of Kashmir over the last 600 to 700 years, starting from the early 14th century, Kashmiri Pandits have faced continual persecution, genocides, rape, massacres, and exoduses. This has been the plight of Kashmiri Pandits for nearly 7 centuries. So what happened in 1990 was not a one-off incident. It was not the first time that the Kashmiri Pandits were butchered. It was not the first time they were ethnically cleansed. It was not the first time an exodus of Kashmiri Pandits happened. It has happened for nearly 700 years, sometimes sporadically, sometimes continually, sometimes for short periods of time, sometimes for much longer periods of time. But in every one of these cases, the motive has always been Islamic radicalism and Islamic fundamentalism. Because Islam wanted to convert Kashmir, erase its history, erase its Sanskriti, and then impose Islam on all of Kashmiri people, including the Pandits. And that's how these exoduses, they started over the last 700 years. Coming to the current context, what really happened on 1990, and what were the events that preceded that? So when you go back slightly about a decade, around 1980 or so, there was Khalistani terrorism that was going on in Punjab. So at that time, Bhindran Wale and others, they used to attack the Hindus. They wanted to cleanse Punjab of Hindus and turn it into a Sikh homeland. By this, I do not mean all the Sikhs are supportive of that. Most of them were not. Only a small number of Sikhs supported the Khalistani movement. But the Khalistani terrorists were pretty focused on cleansing Punjab of Hindus and then getting rid of the Hindus. And so there were times when Hindus were shot dead by the Khalistani terrorists. And the Khalistani terrorism was funded and supported from across the border by the Pakistanis. And when it happened, the Indian security forces started cracking down on them. So they had to expand, and they started moving more and more towards Kashmir. And that's when Islamic radicalism started there in Kashmir as well, in full flow. in the 1980s with support and funding from Pakistan. So the weapons were routed through Kashmir, and then the terrorists were trained, they were sent into Kashmir. And then slowly, as Kashmir started getting radicalized, a lot of Kashmiri Muslims started getting radicalized. They started sending their sons to terror training camps in Pakistan, where they will get trained, they will come back. And then there was a clamor for converting Kashmir into not only a completely Islamic state, but also making it a part of Pakistan. And throughout the 80s, there were many cases when Pakistani flags were flown across Kashmir, and then even the institutions like the J&K police, they were becoming increasingly radicalized, and many of the times terrorists were policemen themselves. So these were all documented and accounted for by Jagmohan when he was governor of Kashmir in his first stint. That was in the mid 80s. Rajiv Gandhi was the Prime Minister of India, and then Jagmohan repeatedly wrote to him. He wrote about a lot of factors. He said there is increasing radicalism, there is cross-border funding and training and support for Islamic terrorism and extremism in Kashmir. And then he talked about, in 1986, he even talked about sporadic killings and the persecution of Kashmiri Hindus. And all of these things were written, and Rajiv Gandhi did not really care. Congress government did not care much. The reason for that was Rajiv Gandhi and Farooq Abdullah were very close friends, and Rajiv Gandhi was not interested in upsetting the apple cart of friendship for the sake of society. So Farooq Abdullah was given free hand, and on the other hand, in society, in Kashmir, society was getting increasingly radicalized with cross-border radicalism and indoctrination continuing. 1988, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto gets killed in an air crash, and at that time there were large processions taken out by Kashmiri Muslim women. Most of them were wailing, and then they were grieving as if one of their own family member had died. So a lot of photographs were published for all of these things. So the reason I recounted all of these things is what happened in 1990. January 19th of 1990 was the last straw that broke the camel's back. It was not the first one. There are a lot of incidents that happened throughout 1980s, and the Congress government in the center did not really care. Okay? It was not bothered about terrorism that was happening there, even though they should have, because they had seen what happened in Punjab in the preceding years. Despite that, they did not care about it. And this allowed Farooq Abdullah, who was, I would consider, not just a separatist, but also the terror mastermind, because he was the person who repeatedly released terrorists. So security forces will capture Pakistan-trained terrorists and put them in prison, and Farooq Abdullah will come out and release them. On one occasion, in the late 1980s, I think it was in 1989, he released about 70 of those dreaded terrorists who had been in prison, and then many of them would go out and kill Kashmiri Pandits in the coming years. So in 1990, before that in 1989, VP Singh comes to power, but he comes to power only on the 2nd of December 1989, and that is only about 4 or 5 weeks before the genocide on January 19th happens. So he does not have a large role to play in this. There is not much he could have done because you cannot sleep for a decade and allow all of this radicalism and extremism to grow and fester in society and take deep roots and expect somebody who has just come to power to come and cleanse the society in just 3 or 4 weeks. That's not going to happen. But on the other hand, VP Singh was very much part of the Congress in the preceding years, and he was very much part and parcel of all of the apathy that Congress government showed towards Kashmiri Pandits in the preceding years. So in that regard, he is guilty. But the first person who is guilty in all of this is Rajiv Gandhi. And the second person who is completely guilty about all of these things is Farooq Abdullah. So these two people were primarily responsible for turning a blind eye to, in the case of Rajiv Gandhi, it was turning a blind eye to the rising tide of Islamic radicalism. In the case of Farooq Abdullah, he was directly responsible for instituting genocide. And why do I say that? On the 18th of January, Farooq Abdullah resigns. He resigns in protest because Jagmohan has been now designated and appointed as the governor of Kashmir. And Farooq Abdullah doesn't want him. So he says, if he is appointed as the governor, then I will resign. So he resigns on the 18th of January. Then on the 19th of January, the massive attacks on Kashmiri Pandits happens. And then it starts with announcements across the mosques all over Kashmir. In every mosque, they make the announcement, convert, die, or leave. Meaning convert to Islam, or get killed, or leave. But it's not just leave, it's leave your women behind, leave the pretty women behind, and then men get out of Kashmir. So this was a very organized campaign. This did not happen overnight. This would have taken immense planning over several years. And then in a very coordinated effort, these announcements were made right after the day after Farooq Abdullah resigns. That's why I think it's very reasonable to argue, very reasonable to conclude that it was Farooq Abdullah who was the mastermind of this genocidal attack on Kashmiri Hindus on the 19th of January, 1990. And when these attacks happen, a large number of Kashmiri Muslims were themselves taking part in this. So one of the characters that's shown in the movie, Kashmiri Files, is a terrorist, right? By the name Bita Karate. That's his real name. And Bita Karate, towards the end, he's the person who shoots 24 or 25 Kashmiri Hindus in cold blood, including women and children, and dumps them into an open grave. So he was arrested, and then he was brought into, he was kept in prison in Tihar jail for several years, and he was even interviewed. And he talks about how everybody in Kashmir was aware of the genocide that was going to happen, except the Kashmiri Hindus. That was because in the mosques and in the madrasas and all of these places, there was a very well-coordinated whisper campaign that was carried out, and they were aware of it. Then Bita Karate also talks about how a lot of the Kashmiri Muslims were dressed up for the occasion on the 19th of January, as if they were attending a festival, and then how many of them participated in the attack and the killing and genocide of Kashmiri Hindus. So in that regard, the Kashmiri Muslims are collectively guilty. And when I make this statement, it becomes a little bit uncomfortable for most people, including Hindus, right? Because it's very easy for us to point out and that an individual like Farooq Abdullah was guilty of carrying out genocide. Most of us will agree with it. It's easy for us to point out that the Muslim terrorists, the Islamic terrorists and radicals carried out these attacks. Most of us will agree with it. That doesn't bother us beyond a point. But when we say that Kashmiri Muslims are collectively guilty of committing the genocide of Kashmiri Hindus, it makes most people uncomfortable. Even Hindus become very uncomfortable about that. So I want to explain that a little bit more. I am going to take 2 or 3 examples to drive home that point. Let's start with untouchability. So in India and in the subcontinent for that reason, the practice of untouchability was in vogue over the last 3 or 4 centuries. Okay. So, and it's not an intrinsic part of Hinduism. Okay, I'm going to take one example. What's the most common word used for untouchables? The word used for untouchables is paraya. Okay, paraya is the term that has become synonymous with untouchability. And paraya, when you go back to history, paraya are a scheduled caste, an erstwhile untouchable caste from the state of Tamil Nadu in India. When you go back about a couple of thousand years, you have a genre of literature called the Sangam literature. And Sangam literature talks about 4 jatis who are most prestigious in society. And one of those 4 is the Paraya community. So which tells us that the Parayas had a place of pride in society, and then they were a dominant community in society 2000 years ago, before all the colonial invasions by the Muslims and subsequently by the Europeans happened. Then you fast forward a little bit, probably around 200 CE or something, when the famous philosopher Thiruvalluvar writes his text called the Tirukural. So Tirukural is a Tamil text. It's a philosophical text, one of the most celebrated texts in India and in Hinduism. And Tiruvalluvar comes from the Paraya Jati. Even today, the priests among the Paraya community are known as the Valluva Pandaram. Okay, so Valluvar is actually a title. It's a upajati among the Parayas, and then he is known as Tiruvalluvar. Tiru means the equivalent of Tiru in Sanskrit and Hindi would be Shri, right? So it's a very honorific title. So he's known as Tiruvalluvar because he comes from that community, and then his philosophical text remains one of the most celebrated texts, not only in Tamil, but in all of Indian subcontinent. This once again tells us that when you go back in time, the Paraya community had a place of pride in society. So you fast forward even until the 14th or 15th century, there was an incident when the Paraya community moves from Tamil Nadu to Kerala to a small place called Valluvanadu in Kerala, and then they found an empire. And then the Brahmins from Gokarna come there, and then they initiate them as Kshatriyas. So this once again tells us that even when you go back 500-600 years ago, some of the communities which are today known to be untouchables and whose name itself has become synonymous with untouchability actually had a place of pride in Hindu society. So untouchability is a relatively recent phenomenon, probably 300-400 years old, but it was a terrible practice. And when that practice happened for whatever reason, right, primarily due to colonial rule, primarily due to crushing poverty, primarily due to agrarian practices that had turned predatory under colonial rule, the rest of Hindu community also practice untouchability. And we don't say that only a few Hindus were responsible for treating the scheduled castes as untouchables. We blame all of society. We apportion collective guilt on all of society. And I think that's just because the reason is when the rest of society is not speaking up, and when the rest of society is not pointing out, hey, wait a minute, why are we treating these communities as untouchables? In the past, they have produced some of the finest philosophers that Hindu Dharma has known. And then, they have had a place of pride in society. In fact, they were among the most celebrated communities in society. Why are we treating them like that? Nobody asked the question. Okay? Society had fallen into ignorance and they are still collectively guilty. So we point out that rest of Hindu society treated the scheduled castes as untouchables. So we apportion collective guilt. Let me take another example. Under the Third Reich in Germany, when the Nazis were in power, when Hitler was in power, Jews, then Gypsies, that's the name they used for Roma people. So all of these people were killed. They were sent to the gas chambers, and there was a terrible Holocaust of 6 million people. And we don't point out that only certain individuals committed this. We say the German society was collectively guilty. And that was for a very good reason, because a practice like the Holocaust did not happen overnight. And it was a result of anti-Semitism that was repeatedly preached in Christianity, that was taught in the churches, and that was imbibed and internalized by all the German people. So when the Jews and the Gypsies were captured, rounded up, and then they were sent in cattle cars to death camps in Sobibor, Auschwitz, and all of these places, the rest of Germans did not even care. They turned a blind eye. And they did not even stop there. They then went and occupied the homes that were originally owned by the Jews. They took away their property. They stole their wealth. They stole their art, paintings, and everything. So we hold the German people collectively guilty for the Holocaust of the Jews and Gypsies. Let's take another example. Slavery in North America. So over 12 million blacks were captured in Africa. They were brought in as slaves by white Christians who had migrated from Europe to America. And Christianity repeatedly taught that blacks were cursed people. They were an accursed people. And then these people had internalized that belief. They brought the black people. They treated them worse than animals. They were made into slaves. They were denied even the most basic human rights. And they were often, the families were separated. So if there was a father, mother, and a child, they could separate the mother from the child and the father and sell her off into slavery somewhere else. This is how the family system was broken up among the black people. Now, not all white men held slaves. Only a very small number of white people actually held slaves. But the rest of white society turned a blind eye to slavery and supported that indirectly. So we hold all of Americans, white Americans, guilty of committing the sin of slavery. So collective guilt is in many situations totally justified when a large number of people are victimized and the rest of society turns a blind eye to that. So by the same yardstick, Kashmiri Hindus were just about 2% of the population of Kashmir. 98% were Muslims. And the rest of Muslim society turned a blind eye to the persecution of Kashmiri Hindus. In many cases, they actively participated in the persecution of Kashmiri Hindus. To give a couple of examples, on January 1990, I already talked about how a large number of mosques made the call for convert, die, or leave to Kashmiri Hindus. And not one Kashmiri Muslim objected to this. Not one Kashmiri Muslim boycotted the mosques that made these calls. And it did not even bother their conscience. So if you are going to blame the Germans, if you're going to blame the upper caste Hindus, and if you're going to blame the white slave owners of North America and others for collective guilt, then we should also hold Kashmiri Muslims collectively guilty. Then, when the Kashmiri Hindus were the genocide happened and the exodus happened, there were widespread rape and butchering of Kashmiri Hindus. Many of them had to flee and live in refugee camps in Jammu and in Delhi. Most of them in Jammu, some of them in Delhi too. What happened to their property? The Kashmiri Muslim neighbors encroached upon their property. They took over their property, and then in some cases, they just wanted to play it safe because they were expecting Kashmir to become a part of Pakistan very soon. So many of them will travel down to Jammu. They'll come to the refugee camps, and then they will talk to their erstwhile neighbors, the Kashmiri Pandits, who are now living in the refugee camps, and they will tell them, look, what happened there was terrible. We have taken good care of your home. Well, we have encroached upon those homes, and we would like to buy those homes from you. And then they'll pay a small pittance, like 10,000 rupees or 20,000 rupees for a home that was probably worth 8 lakh, 10 lakh rupees, sometimes 20 lakh rupees. Even the furniture inside the home should have cost way more than 10 or 20,000 rupees. But they would offer those token amounts, and then they will get the deeds transferred in their name. Why did they do that? And why did the Kashmiri Pandits sell those homes? Because the Kashmiri Pandits were desperate. Many of them had been living in the refugee camps, and in the refugee camps, a large number of them had died. And there were studies conducted. There was one study that was conducted about a refugee camp near Jammu that had 1,200 families, but not a single toilet or a shower. So most of them, they had to just go into the woods for using the toilet and go without shower several days. So this was a community that had been highly educated, that had been holding respectable jobs as professors, teachers, government servants, etc., engineers, and all of these things. And many of these were now forced to live in the refugee camp. There was no source of income, and then they were now desperate to educate their children. So they were willing to do anything, sell off their property. If it brings them 10 or 20,000 rupees in 1990, that would have still been a decent amount of money. That'll keep them going for a few months. They were doing it. So they were desperate. But why did the Kashmiri Muslim neighbors not just encroach upon the home, and why did they get the deeds converted in their name? There were two reasons for that. Okay, one of the reasons was by late 1980s, Pakistani currency was in vogue and in circulation inside Kashmir. And this is shown in one of the scenes in the movie as well. When you go to a vegetable hawker, Mithun Chakravarti, he gives Indian rupees, but he receives change in Pakistani rupees. So Pakistani currency was already in circulation, and many of them thought, since we are going to become part of Pakistan, what are we going to do with the Indian rupees? Okay. So, and the second reason for that was Pakistan had pumped a large number of counterfeit Indian currency into Kashmir. And uh, with the help of conniving local bankers, because I mentioned in the beginning that the local banks, local institutions, government institutions, even the police had become completely taken over by the terrorists. And because of that, a lot of this counterfeit currency had made its way into bank accounts. And these people had, if they were going to become part of Pakistan, then they had no utility for Indian rupees, Indian currency. And if some of that was counterfeit, then they still did not have any need for that. So they had to get rid of both. And now handing it over and then getting a deed legally transferred in that name was worth it. So that was the primary reason many of them traveled and paid a small pittance and got the deeds converted to their name. It did not stop there. So going all the way back, even after the 1990 exodus happened, fast forward until 1996, 1997, there were occasional reports written in the local newspapers, in the English as well as in the local language newspapers in Kashmir, about others, the Kashmiri Muslims, burning down whatever property was left behind by the Kashmiri Hindus and which had not been encroached upon by others. So this continued into the 1990s and still nobody protested. And nobody among the Kashmiri Muslims said what he did was something terribly wrong. Then fast forward a little bit, 2001, Farooq Abdullah, he passes the Roshni Act. And what is Roshni Act? Roshni Act said, if you had taken over the property of Kashmiri Hindus, then you can pay a small amount and tax to the government and probably a bribe to Farooq Abdullah, and then you can get it transferred to your name. And this was something very unique. This did not even happen in Nazi Germany. In Nazi Germany, the Germans went and took over the property of the Jews while Hitler was in power. But once Hitler was killed, once the Nazis fell, Germans did not legislate to legitimize the loot of the Jewish property. This only happened in Kashmir. And that's what makes the Kashmiri Muslims collectively guilty. Because throughout the 80s, they were part and parcel of the growing Islamic terrorism. They sided with it. They sided with Pakistan. They abandoned their own Sanskriti, their own culture. And then they were now getting radicalized. And that makes them guilty. Then second, they sent their own children to get trained as terrorists and come back and commit heinous crimes against Indian society. That was second guilt. Third, in 1990, when the calls were made from the mosque, it was coordinated effort. And this did not happen without all of the Kashmiri Muslims or a very large number of them being aware of them. And this has been confessed to by someone like Bita Karate, the terrorist himself. And that makes them once again collectively guilty. And then when the call for convert, die or leave were made, large number of Kashmiri Muslims who were neighbors pounced on Kashmiri Hindus who had been their own neighbors and attacked them, killed them and everything. And then they took over their property. And then this continued until 1996-97. And by 2001, they legislated. And nobody questioned, why are we legislating to legitimize a loot? They are very happy to take over the property because they did not want the Kashmiri Hindus to come back. And in fact, even into the 2000s, letters to editors were written in the newspaper saying that we have eradicated the cancer from Kashmir. The cancer refers to Kashmiri Hindus, Kashmiri Pandits. And we don't want the cancer to come back to Kashmir. Okay. So Kashmiri Muslims did not want and they did not expect the Kashmiri Pandits to come back, and they were more than happy to take over their property after cleansing them ethnically. This is what makes them collectively guilty. Now let's turn to the question that has been brought up by a lot of leftists, a lot of critics, which is to say, was it really a genocide? Okay, many of them will go to the extent of considering, okay, that was ethnic cleansing, but that was not genocide. So was it really a genocide? Let me bring up the definition from United Nations. And so this is from the United Nations Office on Genocide Prevention and Responsibility to Protect. Okay, so let's scroll down, look at their definition. So this is their definition. Okay, this is the convention. This is the globally accepted definition of genocide. And it reads, Article 2 reads, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following, not all, any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Okay. So in this case, Kashmiri Pandits were both a religious and a ethnic group, and hence they qualify as potential victims. And then one of there is 5 criteria. Okay, if any one of those is met, then it would qualify as genocide. Let's go through that. Number 1, killing members of a group. Yes, a large number of Kashmiri Pandits were raped, they were killed, and everything. Okay, but it did not stop there. Okay, so there was a study conducted in 1996, 1997, and in that study, they visited Dr. K.L. Chowdhury. He visited a lot of the death camps and he carried out a study, and it was also submitted to the National Human Rights Commission. So he pointed out a lot of very, very disturbing facts. It was about the replacement rate among the Kashmiri Pandits living in the refugee camps. So what is the replacement rate? So replacement rate is, in any society, there are some individuals who are going to be dying, and then there will be new individuals being born, right? And for the population to remain, by and large, static, you need a replacement rate of around 1.2 or 1.3. That means for every person who is dying, another 1.2 or 1.3 new individuals should be born. Okay, so whereas what was happening in the death camp, in the refugee camps, was the replacement ratio was 0.3. That was only 3 individuals were being born for every 12 individuals who were dying. Okay, and if that trend continued, then the Kashmiri Hindu population would have simply become extinct. Then second, most of the deaths that were happening in the age group of 20 to 44. So that's the age group when you're most productive, not only to go and work, but also to biologically procreate. So most of the Kashmiri Hindus in the refugee camps were dying in the age group of 20 to 44. Okay, that means with a lower birth rate and with an increased death rate, that too happening in the age group of 20 to 44, that means it's going to accelerate the extinction of the community. Then third that was happening was, among the Kashmiri Hindu women who were in the death camps, 13%, 13% of them were attaining menopause by the age of 34 or 35. And another 30%, 30, were attaining menopause by the age of around 43 or 44. Okay? So this means nearly half of the Kashmiri Pandit women were losing their fertility at a very young age compared to the rest of the population. Okay, this again would have speeded up the extinction of the community. So this means this is directly killing the members of a group. Okay, killing doesn't happen only by putting a knife to the throat and slaughtering that person, but you commit other acts, by starving them to death, by preventing their procreation, by accelerating their deaths by other means. All of these things should be considered as intentional killing of a group. Okay, that's why these were done with the intent to destroy, and that's exactly what happened in the case of the Kashmiri Hindus. And just subpoint A alone qualifies as a genocide of Kashmiri Hindus. And was it an intent? It was absolutely an intent, because all I would challenge is, if somebody thought, okay, that anyone would go to a refugee camp and then lead a comfortable life, should just do this. This is a challenge I'll put forth to any leftist or to any Kashmiri Muslim. Ask your wives and children to go to Jammu railway station and live on the platform for just 3 days. Not one of them will agree to that. And the moment you make that suggestion, you will get divorced. So the reason is, even to live in the comforts of a railway platform where you get food, where you're just going to live for 3 days so you can carry enough money with you. You have restrooms and all, washrooms and everything. So you have all the comforts available, at least to some extent. You won't do that. Now think of those who were going and living in the refugee camps, and you knew what the plight there was, and that means you knew many of them were going to die. And this is also showcased in one of the scenes in the movie where Mufti Muhammad Saeed, who is a home minister, he visits one of the refugee camps in the 90s, in the mid 90s, and then he's callous. Okay, and then when somebody points out a lot of our people are dying in the heat, he says that's going to happen because all these centuries you are living in the cold climate of Kashmir, and now you have come down to the heat of the plains, and many of you will die. Okay, that means they knew that when the Kashmiri Hindus are ethnically cleansed and chased out of Kashmir, okay, large number of them will die because of abject conditions. So that actually proves the intent to destroy. So just the bullet point number one, bullet point A, killing members of a group, based on the points I just summarized, that makes it a qualified genocide of Kashmiri Pandits. Then look at number two, causing serious bodily and mental harm to the members of the group. Yes, that happened. The same study I earlier pointed out, it talks about a large number of Kashmiri Pandits who were living in the refugee camps suffering from PTSD, okay, post-traumatic stress disorder. But they had no means to go and get any treatment. There were cases where individual doctors would visit the refugee camps and try to treat them. But most of us know that treating something like a post-traumatic stress disorder and, girl children suffering from stress-related hormonal disorders, etc., requires very significant treatment. None of that was available to them. And so this is causing serious bodily harm and mental harm to the members of the group. Once again, that qualifies as genocide by the definition of United Nations. I can give one more example. A large number of Kashmiri Hindus were assaulted, their property stolen, many of them killed, hundreds of them were raped. This is direct bodily harm. And that's exactly the reason why the Kashmiri Pandits fled Kashmir on the 19th of January 90. Once again, under Clause B of the United Nations definition, it was a genocide of Kashmiri Pandits. C, deliberately inflicting on the groups conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Once again, the examples I cited, chasing them away, raping them, and stealing their property, plunging them into abject poverty, and creating a situation where their replacement rate is 1/4 of the normal replacement rate. All of these things are deliberate acts, and all of these once again qualify as genocide. And D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. It was not directly imposed, but it was indirectly imposed. And United Nations doesn't make the distinction between direct and indirect imposition. Direct imposition is sterilizing them forcibly, okay, like what the Nazis used to do to a lot of people, like those who were mentally challenged, etc. That was direct imposition. But imposing measures indirectly also qualifies. And in this case, sending them to, under extremely stressful conditions, sending them to the refugee camps qualifies as imposing measures to prevent births within the group. So 4 out of 5 definitions, by 4 out of 5 definitions, this was a genocide of Kashmiri Hindus. And even according to United Nations criteria, only one of these following definitions had to be met. Whereas in the case of Kashmiri Pandits, 4 out of 5 have been met. So it was a clear case of Kashmiri genocide. And before I close the speech, I want to address one more question that's often brought up by leftists, primarily by leftists, and to some extent by the Kashmiri Muslims too. So they bring up the question, yes, Kashmiri, sometimes they will concede, when you push them to the wall, they'll concede, yes, Kashmiri Hindus suffered. There was an ethnic cleansing of Kashmiri Hindus. They won't agree to genocide, but I've demonstrated beyond doubt it was a genocide of Kashmiri Hindus. And then they will admit, well, there was an ethnic cleansing of Kashmiri Hindus, but they will also immediately point out, but a large number of Kashmiri Muslims also died. True, a large number of Kashmiri Muslims also died. I'm not denying that. Okay. However, who's to blame for that? In the case of Kashmiri Hindus, they did nothing, okay, to invite what happened to them. Okay, They were law-abiding citizens. They were peaceful citizens. Okay, they never lifted a gun. Okay, and then they were following their own culture in their own homes, in their own homeland, which they had inhabited for thousands and thousands of years. And they were targeted only because of one reason, that they were Hindus. And then they were victims of Islamic extremism, radicalism, and terrorism. In the case of Muslims, they fall under a few categories, those who were victims. One of them were those who work for the government and whom the uh, terrorists suspected to be informants, and they came and executed them. I feel sorry for them. And then there were rare cases where a few Kashmiri Muslims uh, might have expressed sympathy to Hindus, but those are extremely rare. Okay, and then they were not by any means prevalent or occurring all the time or in a sustained basis. But in some cases they did, and then they were executed by the terrorists, and I sympathize with them. But then they were really small in number. Most of them died because Kashmiri Muslims embraced Islamic radicalism, and then they sent their own children to Kashmir, to Pakistan, to get trained as terrorists, and then they sustained terrorism in their own homeland. And then when terrorism takes hold, uh, then large number of people are going to get killed, okay, either because of fights between various terror groups, because these terror groups were not always seeing eye to eye. One terror group will take out members of another terror group. That happened. And in other cases, the army or the police will act against terrorists, and that's perfectly justified. Any civilized society, law-abiding society will do that. And some of them were killed, but not one Kashmiri Muslim, not one Kashmiri Hindu would have been killed if Kashmiri Muslims had not taken to Islamic radicalism. So while I do sympathize with any person who died or who suffered because of terrorism in Kashmir Valley over the decades, we had to be absolutely clear of one fact. Okay, so in the case of Kashmiri Hindus, they were victims out and out. In the case of Kashmiri Muslims, they sided with Pakistan, they embraced terrorism, and then they sent their own children to get trained as terrorists. And as a consequence of that, some of them suffered. I pity them too, but at the same time, I don't want to equate them with Kashmiri Pandits who suffered for only one reason, because of their religion. And a closing note about this movie. When I went to watch this movie in California, I was very keenly comparing it with Schindler's List. Okay, some of you might have watched the movie Schindler's List. It came out in the 90s, and it was about the Holocaust, right? And then one thing that struck me was the Kashmir Files was way more nuanced and way more powerful than Schindler's List. And here is the reason. Okay, the reason is, in Schindler's List, from the word go, you know who the evil characters are. Okay, the Nazis were the evil characters. You knew that from the word go. Okay, and then you knew that Schindler was trying to protect the innocent people, the Jews. Okay, and Schindler was the good man. Okay, you knew that from the beginning. Okay, so there was no tension. There was no seesaw balance of who's going to win, who's going to prevail. Okay, so it was very clearly known. Okay, this is the side of good, this is the side of evil. That was very clearly known from the beginning. Whereas in the Kashmir Files, it's so brilliantly made. Agnihotri has made it so brilliantly. The leftist professor, the JNU professor, in this movie it's called AMU. So, ANU. So she is made into an extremely powerful character. Okay, at every turn of the event, in every scene of the scene, she comes across as so powerful, and you feel actually sitting and watching the movie, you feel actually despondent. You feel who's going to prevail. Okay, because I think, to me, the hallmark of a powerful movie, a nuanced movie, is something which has very, very balancing characters. Okay, even the evil is portrayed as extremely powerful. Okay, so that's the deep tradition that Hinduism has. Because, for example, if you take the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, take Ramayana for example, Rama is the force for good and Ravana is the force for evil. But when you look at the text, it's not that you don't get to see that from the word go. Okay, so Ravana is also a learned Brahmin. Okay, Ravana is also a Shiva Bhakta, and he is also a good administrator and everything. And so, it's not a unidimensional presentation that makes a movie powerful, but it's a multi-dimensional presentation that makes it nuanced and powerful, and that's what the Kashmir Files is all about. And this is a movie everyone should watch. And I thought I'll share my perspective on that. And thank you very much. Any questions? Happy to take.
Maybe mine is just an observation, or rather just a comment more than a question, because there's so much that you said and we have learned and read about it, and especially I have come more in contact with the subject in the last 15 years. And it's heartbreaking what has happened. But, when we think about it, a very small number of invaders came. And you think, there was a huge population. Anywhere you talk about in India, where it all has happened, why couldn't they just overcome this 10,000, whatever it was? There were so many kingdoms with vast armies. Why didn't they do it? Maybe we digress from the Kashmir situation. But even in, okay, so I'll let that aside. That's something that I have to ponder on and think about it. But with regard to Kashmir, all these Kashmiri Muslims, their ancestors are also all Hindus. They didn't all come from outside. And correct. What is it, that when a Kashmiri Hindu lives so peacefully according to their culture and traditions and all, what is it that once they get converted, what is it that makes them into these monsters?
No, I think those are really good questions. Let me try to address both of them. The first one, did the invaders prevail overnight? They did not. Okay, so this is something, the eminent scholar Sitaram Goyal, he writes about in his book Heroic Resistance of Hindus to All of These Invasions. Okay? So to summarize really quick, Islamic invasions started in the Sindh. According to the standard history, it started in the 8th century, in the beginning of the 8th century, right, when Qasim invades the Sindh. Okay, so whereas Islamic kingdoms don't take root in India for another 400 years. Okay? For 400 years, Hindus keep fighting. Okay, Hindus keep resisting. Okay, this did not happen in any other part of the world. You take Iran, you take all of Arabia. Okay, you take Turkey, you take even Spain and other places that fell to Islam. They all fell within 20, 30, 40 years, nothing more than that, right? And they were simply pushover. Okay, when the Islamic armies went out, they were simply pushover. Okay, and in the case of India, Hindus fought valiantly. They resisted time and again for nearly 400 years. Okay? But again, any war is at the end of the day a war of attrition. Okay, because when the invaders were coming, in the case of Islamic invaders, they were jihadis. Okay, so they were motivated only by one thing: you go and then you fight a war. If you win, you are going to loot their gold, their women, take them as sex slaves and bring them back. That was the motivation. Okay, you can rape the women and you can loot their wealth. Okay, kill the men. In case you die, then you go to heaven. Okay, where you will get 72 virgins. Okay, so either way, they had nothing to lose. Okay, and then they were more than willing to, get on the saddle and then invade India and fight repeated wars time and again. Whereas the Hindus who were defending their kingdom, they had built a society. It was the most prosperous society in the world. That's why everybody was trying to invade India. Okay, and it was the most prosperous society. It was the center of learning. Like today, we talk of a Stanford or a Princeton or anything as a center of learning in modern world. In the ancient world, it were the Indian universities like the Nalanda, the Takshashila, Kanchipuram, Kashmir. Then you go to a place like Pattadakallu or Aihole. So those were all the centers of architecture. Okay, so these were all the ancient world's universities. Okay, and India was center of learning. So Hindus had spent a lot of time creating knowledge, building up society and everything. So when you fight a war of defense, it's also a war of attrition. Okay, so and over a period of time, you slowly start bleeding, and after 200, 300, 400 years, eventually you get weakened. Okay, so this is what happened. So this is one. And then to your second question, Kashmiri Muslims were also Hindus. That's correct. That's why I started with the Sanskriti of everyone having one of the most deeply respected and deeply cherished cultures. Okay, in Kashmir. Okay, whether they are Hindus or Muslims, because Islam came only in the recent centuries. Okay, and then whereas their Hindu heritage, their Sanskriti is thousands of years old. Okay, so but what makes them behave the way they did? Okay, the reason is Islam. Okay, so Islam, I'll just introduce the word here, mimetic virus. I have written about that a lot in my books. For example, most of you are familiar with the word genes, right? So why do children resemble their parents? Okay, they resemble their parents because they inherit their genes. Okay, so because you inherit their genes, you biologically resemble your parents. But now the question is, let's say you are from Punjab, right? So if you're from Punjab, okay, you speak, let's say, with a particular accent, whether you speak Hindi, okay, or you speak English, you speak with a particular accent, okay. And if I am from Chennai, from Tamil Nadu, then I speak English or Hindi or Tamil or anything with a particular accent, okay. But your accent of English will be similar to that of your Punjabi neighbors and your Punjabi friends. So, or your attire, okay, the way you comb your hair, the way you wear your bindi, the way whether you wear salwar or you wear sari and all these things, these all will resemble what your neighbors do. Okay. And why is that? Because we imitate each other in society. Okay, which is a very common thing. That's why we have fashion, right? We have fashion because fashion is all about imitating. Okay, so you want to look like a particular actor, or you want to look like Virat Kohli or something like that, right? So, and hence, how do we imitate each other? Just like a biological trait is inherited by genes, a social trait is copied from one to other through memes. M-E-M-E. Okay, that's why we use the word memes, right? And then we copy memes in social media. That's what it is. Okay, it's about copying. Okay, so some of the memes are harmless. Okay, so most of time, what accent we talk with, it's harmless. It doesn't matter. There's no good accent or bad accent, right? You may be from Odisha and you will speak with Hindi with a certain accent. You'll be from Punjab, you'll speak with another accent. Who cares? Okay, some are even beneficial. Okay, because some practices when you copy from each other, like for example, how you respectfully address one another, it's a good thing because it cultivates vinaya in your heart. It introduces hitam in society, everything. It's a good thing. But some of the memes are also harmful. Okay, some of the memes will alter our state of mind. Okay, and then it will warp our worldview. Okay, and then it will delude ourselves, and these are called uh, virulent memes or mimetic viruses. Okay, and Islam is a mimetic virus because what Islam teaches is, what does it start with? Okay, the kalma starts with Allah is the only God, which means all the other gods are false. And then Muhammad is the final prophet, okay, which means all the other rishis, sages, whether it is Shankaracharya, whether it is Ramanujacharya, whether it's Abhinav Gupta, whether it is, Guru Nanak, whether it is, Sri Narayana Guru, whether it is Ramana Maharishi, they are all false. That's what Islam teaches, right? It teaches your Rama, Krishna, Shiva, everyone is false. Okay, then it says you cannot go and worship in Kedarnath or Badrinath because those are all false worship and those all have to be demolished. Now, if you're a Muslim and then if you have been brought up from childhood to believe that the Quran is revelation from Allah and it is the only true revelation and everything is false, and if you're in brainwash, you'll actually start believing that. Okay, and then Islam also teaches Surah 2, I think it is verse 161. It teaches, waging jihad is a fard. Fard is a religious duty. Okay, so that means once you become radicalized as a Muslim, okay, then you start seeing these things as correct or even religiously mandated duties. Okay, that's why your worldview gets warped and then it is perverted and you can do terrible things. Okay, you can go, rape women just because they belong to another religion. You can butcher them, you can take them into slavery and sell them off into slavery, do all these things and you not feel guilty about it because after all, those people are anyway going to hell when they are dead. And Allah has mandated that you go and fight jihad against these people and you are carrying out your religious duty.
No, it's just beggars belief, that from a highly civilized society that you go to a cult mentality, forcefully converted and then let your children be further converted and further radicalized. it just makes my blood boil, and I just do not understand, even in this day and age, people are willingly accepting what I called a cult. Second largest cult in the world is that.
After Christianity. No, you're right. No, this is an important point, right? Another important point. So let me also respond. It's a very good question. See, what happens is in neuroscience, there is something called persuasibility. Okay. Persuasibility means how can you persuade someone, right? So the persuasibility declines once you reach the age of 8. After that, it starts going down. Okay. Meaning it's hard to persuade someone about something once you have reached the age of 8, especially in matters of religion. Okay. So take Islam, since true of Christianity too, but in the case of today's speech, it's Islam. A child is from cradle till the age of 8. The child is already brainwashed. Okay. So recently I was speaking about the jihad controversy in Karnataka. Okay. And then in that I point out Karnataka has more than 900 madrasas. Okay. And then their curriculum where they teach children, okay, even before they have entered 4th or 5th grade, that is, a child is 8 or 9 years old, right? That's what a 4th or 5th grade child is. Okay. And she's already indoctrinated in the tenets of Islam. Okay. And then made to believe in all of those things. Okay. Now what is happening is an asymmetric engagement of children. Okay. So these children are indoctrinated, brainwashed by the parents, by the mullahs, and by their madrasas from childhood until the age of 8 or 9. By the time their worldview is completely warped. Okay, now they are not willing to listen to a reasonable explanation of Islam or a critique of Islam, and they are not even willing to consider that Hinduism and Hindu traditions are part of their own Sanskriti. They are not interested in listening to that, and they work on. So that's why I think, yes, your anger is completely understandable, completely justified, but we need to start thinking beyond that, because if we don't start educating, a large number of Muslims in today's context, it's the Kashmiri Muslims, right? And then their children, and then we leave them to the mercy of the madrasas, their parents, and the mullahs, then the problem is only going to get worse as time goes by.
After the film was released, there was much political double crossing happening. Like you had Sharad Pawar giving a statement that VP Singh government was in power during the genocide of Kashmiri Pandits, and Mufti Muhammad Syed, who became the Home Minister with the help of the BJP. So, do you have any comments on this?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a good question. I think we should answer those questions, right? So, like I pointed out, the genocide happened on the 19th of January, 1990. Okay. So, VP Singh came to power on the 2nd of December, 1989. That's like 5 weeks before. Okay. Or 5 or 6 weeks before. Okay, that's it. Okay. So, 6 weeks, if you want, realistically speaking, in 6 weeks, it's very difficult for a new government to institute everything, put all the measures in place, and change things overnight. Okay. And like I pointed out, even the police stations had all become the den of terrorists. Okay. So the entire J&K police, for all practical purposes, was on the side of terrorists. Okay. So how are you going to fight? Even if you want to mobilize the army and deploy it, it's going to take several weeks. But at the same time, I would hold VP Singh guilty too. Okay, because VP Singh did not bother to respond to that. Okay, even after the genocide happened. Okay, and prior to that, forming his own government, coalition government, VP Singh was very much part of Congress for several years. Okay, and he was part of Rajiv Gandhi's party. Okay, and in that sense, we cannot absolve him of guilt. He was definitely guilty. Okay, now take the BJP. BJP extended support to the VP Singh government. Okay, so, and it was out of compulsion. Okay, I think so. The BJP extended support to VP Singh primarily out of compulsion, because no party had the majority, and then you had to dethrone Congress, and then you had to, which was very important from a BJP perspective, but also from the Indian perspective, because Congress was primarily responsible for not only Khalistani terrorism, but also for Kashmiri Islamic terrorism. Okay, that happened throughout the 80s. Okay, but BJP is also to some extent guilty. Okay, because even when it happened, BJP could have carried out a massive campaign across country, okay, to educate the people, because Kashmiri Hindus were very much Hindus, and they suffered primarily only because they were Hindus. And if Muslims become majority in any other part of India, or same is happening in Bangladesh, Hindus do suffer there also. There's genocide of Hindus happening in Bangladesh as well. Okay, so for all of these reasons, I think BJP should have carried out a campaign, okay, and educated the people, or at least put immense pressure on VP Singh, forcing him to deploy the armed forces immediately, and not let Farooq Abdullah and all of these characters to continue to run the show there. Okay, to that extent they are guilty. However, if they are 2% guilty, okay, VP Singh and BJP are 2% guilty in this, then Congress and Farooq Abdullah and Pakistan are 98% guilty. Okay, because throughout the 80s, especially when Jagmohan had been repeatedly writing, if Rajiv Gandhi had acted, okay, and he had every reason to act, okay, because he had seen Khalistani terrorism in Punjab, and he knew that it was spreading. The intelligence reports were confirming that the Khalistani terrorism and the weapons are now getting routed through Kashmir, and he should have acted. He did not. Okay, and he should have sacked all of these characters, whether it's Farooq Abdullah, whether it's Mufti Muhammad Saeed, and all of them. They were all terrorists themselves. They were the terror masterminds. Instead, he installed them in positions of power in the center as well as in Kashmir. Okay, so they were able to go out and release the terrorists, and then they were able to, Farooq Abdullah resigns on the 18th, and then 19th of January, immediately the very next day, calls are made from the mosques all over the state. Okay, and then the genocide is launched. So in that case, I would say Rajiv Gandhi and Farooq Abdullah and then Pakistan are 98% guilty. But Muslims, the Kashmiri Muslims, without their connivance, without their collective participation, their collective guilt, none of this would have happened. Okay, I would definitely hold them highly, highly guilty for this.
Two questions. One is that the liberals always tell us that Hindus and Muslims in any region have more in common with each other than Hindus have in common with Hindus from other regions. So what is your comment on that? And secondly, regarding BJP, I would like to tell you that National Conference was part of the second BJP government that stayed up to 2004. That was in power until 2004, part of Vajpayee's coalition. So what is so their guilt is not 2%, probably more. That is what I would like you to comment on. Thank you.
Sure. I'll start with the second question. I think the 2% or 4 or 5, we can always debate those things, right? And it's always going to be a subjective opinion. Mine is subjective and so is yours. I'm fine with it. But we both agree there is an element of guilt, right? And something like National Congress should be held primarily guilty of launching terrorism and committing the genocide of Hindus, and hence one should have never had any truck with those. Okay, so I understand, I agree with that, and real politics is not always justifiable, and there may have been compulsions why it was done, because the alternative could have been worse in 2001. For example, the alternative could have been more radical Islamist government taking over Kashmir, and hence those defense considerations would have compelled Vajpayee to form such a coalition. But regardless, I think from a dharmic perspective, I'll agree with you. Okay, so that kind of real politics is not justifiable. I would have just gone and imposed army rule, governor's rule, president's rule in Kashmir even in 2001 if I had been Vajpayee. I am not Vajpayee. That's a different story. Now to your first question, Hindus and Muslims in a region have more in common than Hindus between two regions of India. Okay, let's break that into two parts. The first part is something I'll completely agree with. That's why I started, the story with the Sanskriti of Kashmiris. Okay, both the Muslims and Hindus in Kashmir share the same culture. They share the same heritage. They have the same Sanskriti. That's why they have everything in common. And if at all anything, Islam is the sickness that afflicted the Kashmiri Muslims only in the last few centuries. Okay, it started in the 14th century and gradually increased, and they became more and more radicalized. It's a cancer they got in the last 500 or 600 years. Whereas the culture they have is thousands of years old, goes back to the Vedic times. They share the same common Shaka. Okay, then when Panini refers to them as Kashmirikas, he makes no difference, no distinction among all of the people who are inhabitants of Kashmir at that time. So yes, they have Hindus and Muslims of a particular region have a lot in common between them, but we should not ignore the fact that the moment somebody gets converted to Islam, very quickly they get radicalized. Okay, they start denying their heritage, they start denying their Sanskriti. Okay, they start, it's not us who are telling, hey, you have got nothing to do with our culture. We are actually going and telling the Muslims, we both share the same culture, so don't give it up. Okay, but the moment a Muslim gets indoctrinated, a Muslim gets radicalized, he starts shunning Hindu culture, his own culture, her own culture, the culture of their own ancestors, and then they start deluding themselves that their heritage starts only in 610 CE when Muhammad started reading the Revelation, and they start pretending that, or deluding themselves that the culture of Arabia is their culture. Okay, so yes, I will agree with the first one, but with the important caveat. And it's not enough for the leftists to make this argument only as a rhetoric. They should go and tell this to every Muslim and say, by the way, your Sanskriti is same as that of the Hindus. That means the Bharatanatyam, the Kathak, the Odissi, then the Hindu classical music, and all of these things, the recitation of the Vedas, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, they are all part of your culture as much as it is part of the Hindu culture. Go and study these things. They should start telling that to the Muslims. Then the problem will completely disappear. Then coming to the second question, do Hindus from different regions of India have less in common between them? That I would disagree with. Okay, so for example, there are things that are different, right? Languages, for example. Okay, I am a Tamil speaker, and then somebody from Assam or Punjab would be speaking a different language, Assamese or Punjabi. Okay, our languages are different, but our Sanskriti is not only defined by language. Okay, it's not only defined by our cuisine. It's defined by something much deeper. The notion of dharma. Okay, then the notion of what is sacred, what unites all of us. Okay, that's why when you look at it, you take, for example, among the Vaishnava traditions, there is something called the concept of Divya Desha. Okay, so these Divya Desha are distributed all over India. And when you take a Vaishnava, he or she will travel to every one of them, and then their goal is to visit every one of those during their lifetime. Or you take the Yatris of India, for example, Kashi is a good example. So you have Kashi, and that's in today's what is Varanasi today, and then that's the Vishwanatha temple. Then you go to Uttar Kashi in the Uttarakhand region, so you have the same Kashi Vishwanatha temple. Then you go to Kumbakonam in Tamil Nadu, you have the Kashi Vishwanatha temple. One is the Uttar Kashi, the other is the Dakshin Kashi. Then you have at the center you have the Kashi Vishwanath Mandir in Varanasi. So why is this happening? The reason this is happening is Hindus, even in the bygone era, even 2000 years ago, 3000 years ago, 4000 years ago, knew that there are going to be always regional differences, there are going to be linguistic differences, and differences in terms of ethnicity and other things. But there is something much deeper, which is part of our Sanskriti, which is rooted in Dharma, which unites all of us. That's why an Adi Shankara who was born in Kerala, travels all the way to Kashmir, and then he preaches there. And then you will have, someone like Sri Chaitanya who was born in Bengal, he travels to Odisha and he preaches. In those days, it would have been very long distance. And then you have someone like, a Sikh guru, like, Gobind Singh Ji, he will go there and he will meditate in the Himalayas, and all of these things happen, right? So, that's why it's very important for us to look deeper than the superficial differences. And when you look deeper, we actually, Hindus have a lot in common, and we are pretty seamlessly integrated.
First, I would start with, I think this is a very common myth which has been propagated, that Hindus and Muslim in the same region are very similar to each other. I have grown up in a Muslim majority area, and I'll tell you, in day-to-day life, yes, you are right, Mr. Venkat, that heritage-wise, yes, we have common heritage, but day-to-day there are very, very clear differences which will stare you in your face, and it is true for both parties, not just for Hindus or not just for Muslims, for both of them. I'll not go into details because of paucity of time, but it's very clear that we are very different from each other.
So let me just react to that really quick. So I think we are in total agreement there. In fact, that's why I pointed out it's the Sanskriti which is common.
Right.
But the moment a person is converted to Islam, he or she is taught, even before that person attains the age of 8, that being part of a Muslim identity is a denial of your Hindu Sanskriti. Okay, so that's
Right.
why
Yeah. So thank you, and actually, let me build on it. Psychologically, I think this is one reason why Hindus who have converted to Islam actually are more dangerous and dreadful than the original Muslims, because they have to demonstrate and prove that they have actually adopted the new thing completely by the core. And the only thing which Islam and Quran teaches is violence mostly. And that is why all of these people end up engaging into a violent mechanisms to prove that actually they have arrived.
you're absolutely correct there. In fact, Swami Vivekananda said it better, and I think nobody can say it better than he did. He said, when a Hindu leaves the fold of Hindu Dharma, it's not just a Hindu less, but an enemy the more.
Exactly. And that goes back to what our first questioner, I think Ms. Indira, if I remember the name correctly, this is the reason why these people are so violent, and why whatever happened in Kashmir actually happened in such a gruesome manner. And it was, as you rightly pointed out, Mr. Venkat, I think it was all a very well planned thing which happened right from the Abdullah resigning, all the CPRF battalions being called into the city, and everything happening in the villages and remote areas, to the exodus to the camps in Jammu, where they were actually set up to die again. Whoever were remaining, they will actually die again. And I think state and all the powers who were there at that point in time, they were all hand in glove with each other. So it was a very well planned, well thought out genocide, as you rightly pointed out. Though I wonder actually what UN, so as to say, or our Human Rights Commission of India were doing, and all of that, and which is a little perplexing, but I think it's moot point right
It
now.
should not be
So thank you.
perplexing, because it should not be perplexing, because the Human Rights Commissions and Human Rights Watch, UN, and all these people, they don't care about Hindu victims. Okay, so occasionally they may indulge in tokenism. Whether it is Pakistani Hindus, whether it is Bangladeshi Hindus, they are all victims of genocide, same as Kashmiri Hindus, right? And these people don't care. When you really push them to the wall, they will make a token statement. Oh yes, we sympathize with them, but beyond that, they don't really care, because Hindus don't constitute their vote bank. But something is even deeper, because there is a clear dichotomy between the Abrahamic worldview and the non-Abrahamic worldview. Okay, whether it is Hindus or Eastern religions or Native American shamans and all of these things, these are all the non-Abrahamic worldviews. These are totally different. And whether it is UN or the Western world, they are all, whether they are practicing Christians or Muslims or not, they are still shaped by an Abrahamic worldview. So for them, our worldview is something they cannot relate to, and they don't care about as much. And in fact, now that we have articulated why it was a genocide, I expect United Nations to go back and change the definition a little bit.
Yeah, this is a question about what you just said at the end of your response. So you said that Hindus have a unity at a deeper level than superficialities, which I completely agree with. And for anybody who thinks this is obvious, but somehow for whatever reasons, it doesn't seem to work on the ground, in the sense that Hindus in one region have not spontaneously gone, maybe things will change for the better, to the aid of Hindus in some other region. I mean, don't you think that deep connection is not very obvious to most Hindus?
So the reason it happens is, if you take that, there's a very fundamental difference between Abrahamic religions and Dharmic religions, right? By Dharmic religions, I include Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and all of these religions, right? So there is one fundamental difference, okay, which is, for the most part, they are congregational, we are not. Okay, so meaning, for you, you can find a devout Hindu who would have spent her entire life visiting only one temple, right? She would have visited that temple twice, thrice a day, and attended all the festivities there and done that. So she's not really part of the congregation. She may not even know the name of the priest in that temple. Okay, because for us, when we talk of adhyatma, pursuits, what it really means is it's a very personal connect, right? And whether we connect to the divine or whether we study a darshana like Advaita or any one of these things, these are very personal quests for Hindus. Okay, and then even when we attend a festival, something like a chariot festival or a village festival or any one of these things in a temple, again, there's festivity, but it's not a congregation. Now, contrast this with Islam or Christianity. They are very congregational religions. Okay, you take a mosque, probably a couple of thousand Muslims attend the same mosque every Friday. Okay, and for the entire life. But very importantly, they listen to sermons from the same mullah all the time. Okay, and then they are always kept on a tight leash, and then they are radicalized. Then same with the Christians. Okay, the Christians have to attend the same, and the priests will, the Christian pastors and padre, they will check the attendance, everything. And in fact, if they don't attend and if they don't fall in line, they won't even get admission in Christian schools and other things, right? So this is the fundamental difference. I think, to me, in my opinion, Ramakrishnan-ji, we should not change the fundamental nature of Hindu society. Okay, the reason for that is it is this fundamental nature which gives us the freedom. Okay, why do we have so many darshanas? Okay, we don't have just single scripture, we have thousands of scriptures. We don't have a single prophet, but we have thousands of rishis. Okay, and then there are so many pursuits, whether it's yoga, dhyana, or tantric techniques, and all of these things, which continue to evolve day in and day out. And this is the beauty of Hindu Dharma, because this is an inner quest, and this is a lifestyle which is very comprehensive, which includes arts, which includes music and everything, architecture and all of these things. I think we should not abandon that, because if we become congregational, then at some stage or the other, we'll become like the Abrahamic religions. Instead, what we should do is, we should treat these Abrahamic religions as cancers afflicting society, and then we should initiate legislative means to crack down on them. Okay, nationalize their institutions, their places of worships and everything, and make sure that over a period of time, we do a garvapsi of those people by very dharmic means, by very legitimate means. That's what I would recommend.
Just one comment on the Karnataka government freeing the temples from the government control. And just my wish is that it happens in other states as well, and that all that money that could be used now to open up gurukuls within the complex of the temples, and used for hospitals for the poor people, of the Hindu poor people, and dharmshalas or whatever, which Hindus need to be accommodated for. And that's my hope and pray, that this is how the money would be used, at least starting off in Karnataka. I don't know how it will follow in the other states, but I hope that what happens. And on another note, Ambedkarji was right. It should have been an exchange of population. We wouldn't be saying all this now, But then,
that's great.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, I agree. I think there was a question in chat from Ramakrishnan-ji about Sikh congregation. I think you are referring to the Khalisani movement, and let me briefly touch about this. So, Sikh separatism is relatively recent, and our Punjabi friends on this would know that. So, I mean, even today, Sikhs and Hindus in Punjab do intermarry. Okay, and it's very common. Okay, and then you will find, if you let's say, for example, undertake the Chardham Yatra, it is very traditional for Hindus on the way when you go to Gobind Ghat, and then from there they will proceed to Hemkund Sahib, and then they will take a darshan, and then they'll come back. And of course, only those who can walk, because I think it's 22 kilometers of trekking. So most Indians have become lazy in the current generation, so most don't do that. Okay, but if you just look at people who are traditional, they still do that. And then similarly, the Sikhs who are visiting that, they'll from there proceed to Badrinath, and then they'll take a darshan, come back. This is common even today. And so talking of Sikh separatism, it's a relatively recent phenomenon. Okay, it starts in around the 1890s. Okay, there was a fellow by name Arur Singh. Okay, and then he wrote a book called Hum Hindu Nahi Hai. Okay, and then the reason for that was he was a British bootlicker, right? And then he was the person after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, when when Dyer was being questioned by the British Parliament. He wrote letters to him, to the Parliament, saying that he absolved General Dyer, and then he invited Dyer to the Golden Temple and gave him an honorary. Made him an honorary Sikh, and all these things he did, right? So, and then the reason for that was this Hum Hindu Nahi Hai was a very small section of Sikhs who subscribed to that at that point in time. And now fast forward to the 1930s to 1960s, 70s. One good example in the United States is Dilip Singh Sangh. Okay, so he wrote a book called My Mother India. Okay, so he was the first non-Abrahamic to become a congressman in the US. Okay, he became a congressman in the 50s, I think, sometimes in the 1950s. Okay, so, and then he writes about My Mother India, and throughout the book he refers himself to as Hindu. Okay, and he says our Hindu Dharam, our Hindu Dharam, our Hindu Dharam. That's what he repeatedly talks about. He's a Sikh. He was a Sikh. Okay, and then so the point is, Sikh being a separate identity is of a relatively recent phenomenon. It got a little bit more accentuated and a little bit more radicalized in the Khalistani movement. But the threat is real. I'm not saying the threat is non-existent. To some extent, it does exist in some of the gurdwaras, more in the Western world, but to some extent even in Punjab in India. But at the end of the day, I think that threat we need to deal with, not the way Indira Gandhi and others dealt with it, but more by going back to the roots. Because when you look at the Sikh gurus, they called themselves Hindu leaders. Okay, and then someone like Tegh Bahadur and others, they call themselves Hindu leaders, and then Arjan Dev and others, they call themselves Hindu leaders. And then when the Mughals behead some of the Sikh gurus, that's what they call them. They call them, you are a leader of Hindus. Those are the letters they write to them and say, as a leader of Hindus, you have done this, which is against Islam. Okay, that's how they list the charges. Okay, so I think we should not lose sight of this important continuity and yield to a little bit of the separatism. That's the point I make.
Ravi J is asking, what's the point in promoting this credo of Quran in one hand and laptop in another, if the educated Muslims are following the same path as the radicals? Your comments on that, please.
So, I think what's the alternative? Okay, so the alternatives, look at the alternatives. Right? The alternative is, if there had been a complete population exchange as Ambedkar argued for, I think it would have been a different story. Okay, then all of Pakistan would be a total basket case, and India could have progressed way more without dealing with these kind of problems. But we are dealing with the reality. Okay, the reality is India has 13-14% or 15% Muslim population. Okay, now this population, if we don't modernize them, okay, and then if we don't make them part of the mainstream, okay, it's going to be problematic, because then they are going to come under the increasing influence of the mullahs and then the radical forces, the madrasas and others, and that will be even worse. Okay, and then second thing to look at, right? And there is a very interesting online conversation between Yasir Qadhi and Zakir Naik. Okay, so Zakir Naik, most of you are probably familiar with. He's a radical, and he's a fundamentalist, a bigot, you name it, every one of those things. And he is wanted by the Indian government, and he's hiding in Malaysia right now. Okay, and Yasir Qadhi is, on the other hand, is a ultra fundamentalist Muslim imam. Okay, he's a Pakistani American Muslim imam, and but also a very, very well-respected scholar. Okay, he went to the University of Medina. He studies there for several years, and then Yale University, and he's an academic, everything, and he's a highly respected scholar too. Okay, among the Muslims. Okay, and even among the academics, I would say. So they both have a conversation where they talk about apostasy in Islam. Okay, so they talk about when even in countries like Saudi Arabia, when they come into contact with outside world, more than 25% of them become apostates. Okay, I think this number is true because I'm working with a lot of ex-Muslims or those who are only nominal Muslims, okay, who are based in Pakistan and other places, and they do point out the same thing. They say, among the Muslims in places like Pakistan, there is a huge discontent, okay, because they do see the contrast, right? They see the contrast between India and Pakistan, okay. So, India has progressed economically. India has progressed as a society. We have freedom, okay, and then India has built phenomenally good institutions. It's a power to reckon with, okay. 1947, both countries became independent, and both countries were in abject poverty. But look at India today. India is talking of building a $5 trillion economy. India is launching rockets. In fact, ISRO launches more rockets than NASA or all the space agencies in the world combined, okay. And India's education system is one of the most sought after in the world, and all of these things, right? So India is a powerhouse, okay. So they see the difference, and then think of it also, I have had and in the future I'm planning to bring out a series of videos on this. And what if you are a Muslim man or a woman, okay, living in a place like Pakistan, okay. So you cannot speak up against the religion. You don't a lot of those things don't resonate with you, because unlike in the past, today you have your iPhone at your fingertip, and you have your social media, and you can actually listen to a lecture by Sadhguru, right, of Isha Foundation, okay. And then in those 5 minutes, the arguments he makes are so powerful, and they resonate with someone who's a Pakistani Muslim. They start thinking, okay, they subconsciously start contrasting this with what they hear from their mullahs, okay. And then they and this also the age of the internet, right? And then when they start searching, they can type words like Vedanta, and then they can start reading upon something like what Shankara wrote and other things, and they start seeing the difference, okay. There is, on the one hand, one religion is very dogmatic, the other is not. One religion accords freedom, other doesn't. And then society which follows one religion is progressing and enjoying more freedom, and the other one, which is following Islam, is stagnating. They see that. So there is discontent. I think we are looking at an inflection point where we can actually reach out and weaken Islam, or even make it go away, okay. Because without any of our effort, if 25% of the Muslims are apostatizing, even in Muslim countries, I think with some effort this can get better. And I think this is where I think all Hindus should familiarize themselves with some of the recent researches. It's called it's about, which just came out in the last 2 years. It's about the direction of the early Islamic Qiblas, okay, by Dan Gibson, okay. So every mosque you go to, there is a prayer wall. It's called Qibla, okay. So the prayer wall faces in the direction of Mecca, okay. You have to pray towards Mecca, okay. That's why every mosque will have it, okay. And then this comes from a Quranic revelation, okay, which was revealed, I think, around 624 CE or something, okay, around that time, okay. Which say before that, according to Islam, people are praying in the direction of Jerusalem, but then there is a verse from Allah that says, henceforth pray in the direction of Mecca. That's why the Qibla walls were created. So which means from 624 CE, that's the last 8 years of Muhammad's prophetic career and beyond, you should not come across a single mosque where the Qibla wall faces in any other direction. So Dan Gibson has done a phenomenally good research, and it's called Early Islamic Qiblas. Qibla is spelled as Qibla or Qiblah, okay. Early Islamic Qibla, okay. So he points out, for the first 130, 140 years, 150 years, every single mosque is facing in a different direction other than Mecca, okay. In fact, all of them are facing in the direction of Petra, okay. Now, if really a Quranic verse had been revealed by Allah in 624, this could not have happened, okay. Then no Muslim would have built a mosque facing in a different direction. They would have all started facing Mecca. But this actually tells you that the Quranic verses were not revealed in that time, okay, and then they were revealed much later. Then this brings into question around the very historicity of Muhammad himself. Okay, did Muhammad exist, or were all these stories concocted in the 8th, 9th century and then retroactively projected on mythical or semi-historical Muhammad of a bygone era? Okay, so if this kind of findings are made popular, it will be very difficult for Muslims to deny the truth and refuse to confront Islam. Okay, because once you challenge the very authenticity of the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad, which are very easy to do, in my opinion, a lot of scholars have done it, but just that the leftist media doesn't let all those things come into the public view. But then we Hindus should take up that initiative of doing that.
Sir, I had a question about foreign invasions. Sir, we see the Kushana period, the Shaka invasion, but the case of Islamic invasion was very much different. The way the idols were replaced in favor of all Islamic ones. So the case of Islamic invasion was very much different. Even before Islam, we had foreign invasions, but such use of sex slavery was not there. So
Right.
how do you view this? And in like we see Sam Huntington putting it as clash of civilizations. So how do you view?
It is in a way a clash of civilizations. That's a very good question, by the way. And so the Kushanas came from the outside, right? And then sometimes it can be argued that some other groups, for example, like the Jats, some of the Gurjars, may have also had some Central Asian connections. We do not know for certain, but that's quite a possibility. So because some of the genetic evidence seems to suggest that they may have Central Asian connection, the same with the Rajputs too. So when all of them came, there is a fundamental difference between Abrahamic religions and non-Abrahamic religions. Okay, in non-Abrahamic religions, everything is sacred, right? Your nature is sacred, your rivers are sacred, the place where you live is sacred. Okay, so the flora, the fauna, everything is sacred. So that's why they have deities that are for different purposes. There is a deity for rain, okay, and this you'll find in every culture which is non-Abrahamic. Then you have a deity for learning, you have a deity for fertility, and then all of these things you have deity for agriculture and deity for warfare and protection and all of these things. So when the Kushanas and others came into India, okay, they were not bringing one monotheistic deity and imposing it on others. Okay, so they knew that if I'm going to a different place, I will come across another deity that is going to be the local guardian. Okay, and I'm going to worship a different river. I'm going to treat a different vana or a forest as sacred. Okay, so they were easily able to adapt. Okay, that's number one. Then number two, in all of the non-Abrahamic traditions, your samskaras and then your Sanskriti is also very closely related to your jati. Okay, so you from your birth to your funerary rites, you perform all of these things according to your jati traditions, and non-Abrahamic religions don't try to change it. Okay, so when people come from some other geography and then they settle down in India, whether as invaders or whether as traders or anything, they can just continue to follow their Sanskriti, and then they can follow their own old samskaras, and nobody will force it or force them to change, right? It's dharma that connects everyone. Whereas in the case of Abrahamic religions are monotheistic. But what is monotheism? Monotheism is about denial of every other divinity and every other deity and everything else that the world considers sacred. Okay, and replace all of that with that one intolerant and jealous God of Abrahamic religions. This is true of Judaism, this is true of Christianity, this is true of Islam. Since we are talking about Islam in today's context, when Islam comes, they come with the same mindset, right? Allah is the only God, Muhammad is the only prophet, final prophet, and then Quran is the only scripture, and then idol worship has to be suppressed, has to be rooted out, and Hinduism has to be rooted out, and that's why you have this concept of Ghazwa-e Hind, right? And then for them it's a sacred duty. And then so for all the others, when they invaded, Kushans or anyone, when they invaded, they just came as invaders for political reasons, right? They wanted to expand their kingdom, that's all. or they got kicked out of Central Asia somewhere, and then they came to India, and then they founded a new kingdom. That's it. Okay. So, but in the case of Islam, it is the desire to establish Darul Islam, and Darul Islam is the world of Islam, and it gets established only when you obliterate the Darul Harb, which is the world of the infidels. Okay. So, in other words, it's your religious duty, and it's your mission, and it's your goal to root out Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism, and all of these religions, destroy the temples, their gompas, their gurdwaras, and everything, and burn their scriptures, and destroy the temples, and kill their people when they refuse to convert, and then impose jizya upon them as a temporary workaround, and then finally hope to impose Islam and only Islam on rest of society. So that's why you find this kind of fanatical zeal when Muslims come. It has got nothing to do with where they came from. It's not about whether they were Central Asians, whether they were Turks, or whether they were Turkish, or any one of these things. It was because of the Islamic doctrines and the Islamic teachings.